requirement solved it. And to some extent, why you made those choices with that particular type of solution, right? It's the great missing piece. Okay, so let's talk about these a little bit. Extra Salesforce requirements, right? You know, a classic user story here is a great place to get started, right? If you haven't run into user stories yet, as a blank, I want to blank so that I can blank, right? As a sales manager, I want to view all of my representatives, agents, pipelines so that I can effectively manage capacity and workload. Very illuminating and useful statement, right? They can be very rich, they can be short, they can be long. It's a highly adaptable technique. It's been around for a long time and it's highly proven, right? That's like the core of a requirement. It's most basic. You can also really get into stuff around lots of different types of artifacts that capture those requirements. If you haven't done it yet, I strongly recommend the UX designer and strategy designer certifications. They spend a lot of time talking about requirements processes and a lot of really great techniques and ways that you can capture these types of things, right? One of my favorites is jobs to be done, right? So it's this idea of like a particular app or configuration or set of functionality has certain jobs that it does, and capturing those jobs gives you this idea of like multi-use or, you know, flexibility in different types of contexts, right? But above all, one thing that's really important is this is non-technical, plain English, right? These are things that the users can read and understand, right? This is a way that you bring everybody to the table, right? We're going to bring all the boys to the yard, right? Because it's accessible to everybody. And that's a critical part of software development, right? That everybody's voices are being heard, and it absolutely fronts the user, right? This is part of, as software developers, and I would argue that even if you're developing declaratively, you are a developer, right? As software developers, this is the most important thing for us in the sense of practicing empathy, understanding the user's viewpoint. Why do they have this requirement in the first place, right? All of this helps drive change and manage risk, right? By capturing this viewpoint and clarifying the underlying reasons and context why a particular requirement exists, right? Here's a really classic user story map. Guys, I stole this straight from Trailhead, right? So there's a lot of really great material on Trailhead that really digs into some of this stuff, and I strongly recommend it. Also, if you are kind of newer to the ecosystem, there's an organization called Atlassian, and they are people who make a number of different products used for documentation. They're kind of a leader in the agile software development movement, and they have some amazing training available on user stories as well. Hard recommend, right? There's more though, right? Like there's classic user stories, but also there's a good old process map, right? I love a good process map, right? Anything that involves a process with multiple steps, we consider that at Navigators a minimum documentation requirement, is to get some sort of process map, even if it's only like a list of steps, right? Usually it's a visual representation of a particular process, right? It can be a flow chart. You can do it in Lucidchart. You can do it on a PowerPoint slide. You can do it in lots of different ways, right? The idea here is it's capturing stages and change over time, right? First we do this, then we do this, then we do this. And a lot of times it also includes disposition of things like records or particular assets or related documents, right? The point of this is it gets everybody onto the same sheet of music. Yes, this is the process. We are all in agreement. This is what's happening now, right? And it can be a really great way to highlight sticky points in a process, problem areas, right? And do it in a quick way where everybody can grasp it together. Here's what's called a swim lane flowchart. So there's this idea of you create what are, you know, these little bars that people call swim lanes. They can refer to stages. They can refer to people, right? It's just another way to add another visual dimension to a flowchart. So here we have just like a really basic, you know, working on issues and reporting issues, right? And it starts with the customer and then it goes to sales and we get yes, no's, but you can follow a particular scenario through this and understand the business process very quickly. So I'm a huge fan of even just like a classic basic flowchart. Now you can get fancy. So this is something I'm seeing more and more around the ecosystem. If you've ventured onto architect.salesforce.com, which Shout out to the architect team. They're doing amazing work, putting out amazing assets that are super useful. This is what's called UPN, or Universal Process Notation. They've got a bunch of really great material, and there's some trailheads on this too. This does require some tooling, right? But we have all these steps, and then all of these little things in the squares mean things, right? Like, are there sub-processes? Are there attachments? Like, what is the step? Who is responsible for something? Who is consulted? You can squeeze a RACI into this. It's a really rich way of capturing processes. But I really show this to say it's a vector. You can start with a basic flow chart. You can go all the way to something more sophisticated if that's the need that you have.
Hey, Haley, let me interrupt you real quick.
Sure.
You just said you can stick a RACI in there.
Yes.
Responsible, accountable. What's the rest of it? My mind is blank here.
Supports, consults, and informs.
Okay.
So
And
for folks that
not
are
everybody might have been familiar with that term, so I figured
yeah, that's a really good
clear
point.
it up.
Yeah, we definitely should. So a RACI is a it's a thought exercise where you look at a particular role or a particular function and you define who is responsible for it, who is accountable for it, who supports that process or step, who is consulted in it, and who should be informed. And it's really useful for when you have complicated teams that are working together on projects, because it clarifies different roles and steps in the interplay between the two of them. And on this chart, you can see here where we have like little R's and A's, I's, those are the letters in the RACI. So what we're essentially seeing here is who is responsible for different types of, so like accountable, in this case, fixing the issue would be development, which makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to some degree, you could almost view those almost like the swim lane chart that you showed just a minute ago too,
I think there is, I 100% agree, right? So I think that those are both ways to capture that dimension of the person and the personality in a way that's quick to absorb. I like a RACI written out, but me personally, I love swim lanes because I like the visual separation.
Yep.
Everybody has their preferences, and that's part of the fun of documentation. Yep. Awesome. Thank you for that. I would have missed that. Okay. That's extra Salesforce stuff. A couple of my favorite things. Let's move over now to talking about documenting Salesforce itself. So here's where we come back to that, you know, what most people mean when they're talking about documentation, which is essentially your metadata, right? So first big thing you can do is data models or ERDs. And I'm going to guess that everyone on this call has probably seen these before, right? And this is what most people go to first, and for good reason, right? It's a really good visual representation of an org, how it's structured, how it's put together, right? Shows those parent-child relationships, shows different types of things using colors and shapes, right? And they can get really quite fancy, right? How is it useful and how does it drive your change? Well, it's just very quick. It's a quick way to get understanding of how Salesforce is structured. As we all know, and we won't spend too much time on this, but Salesforce is hard typed, which means data types are not malleable, right? Things need to be what they are, right? And it is stored in a non-normalized state, which means those relationships are very durable. So we need to get that right so that we can get the reporting out of it that we want, right? So this is really critical for relational databases and really clarifies all of those relationships.
And then ERD is entity relationship
entity
diagram?
Relationship diagram, I'm pretty sure. Maybe if I'm wrong, somebody can correct me in the chat.
It kind of looks like you're showing one off right now.
Here's one right here. Also, if folks haven't seen it, if you go into setup and search on Schema Builder, you can create an ERD live of your own org by just checking the objects, and it will make all of the connections for you and show you the relationships, and it's magical. I love that you can so quickly grab an image that shows a relationship in Salesforce. And there's a lot of information here too that I want to start opening people's eyes to if this is newer to you. If you look at something here, like, and I think this is from, by the way, I think this is from the Dreamhouse package in Trailhead, if I remember correctly, right? Here we have a property, right, which is a custom object. And you see that there's a line that goes from property to favorite. And we got what looks like a little witch's broom on the end of favorite, right? That means that there could be multiple favorites for one property. So master detail, our child parent lookup, right? An open circle means it is not mandatory. If it's solid, it's mandatory, right? So you can see how we can squeeze a lot of information about the structure of Salesforce into one of these images. Great teaching tool, right? Great for facilitating technical conversation. Here's a really big honking one, right? Again, shout out to architect.salesforce.com. There are ERD diagrams for most of the major clouds and products available there. I often start with these, and also they make these downloadable in Lucidchart. So if you want to grab like only a section of it and delete a lot of the rest of it and work with it, you can do that very readily. So it's a really amazing resource. We're not going to spend a bunch of time looking at the Sales Cloud ERD, but this is my example of how ERDs can be really quite sophisticated. All right. What about data dictionaries? If you have started looking into Salesforce, and you've started thinking about how you want to document your Salesforce, you've probably run into the concept of a data dictionary, right? What is it? It's literally just a list of objects and fields, right? It's literally definitions for the fields, right? And it usually includes the data type. So again, we talked about how Salesforce is hard typed, and that can be challenging for us, even though it enforces data quality. A data dictionary would have things like, this is a date field, this is a number field, it gets 3 digits after the decimal point. That type of information would be in your data dictionary, right? The idea is that it's usually put somewhere where the users can access it, and it's written in layman's terms, right? I consider this to be user-facing documentation. There are a lot of people who don't use it that way, but I'm a really big fan of managing requests for extra fields that you don't really need by making it clear to everybody what fields are there, right? By making that something that they can look up. I've also built this in Salesforce before as an app, which is really great because you can reference it in validation rules. So when people hit a validation rule, they can click on the particular field and see exactly why the validation rule is there and read information about it, right? It's just really good for keeping everybody up to speed with what is in Salesforce, whether they have the security permissions to see it or not, right? It promotes that transparency. It makes restricting and validating data a whole lot easier. It's also really great for just like letting people know about the changes that you are making in Salesforce. Really foundational piece of documentation. Also super simple, right? Like a regular old spreadsheet really does the trick here, right? I've linked in the custom help menu before. I've linked these spreadsheets from like Google Drive, lickety split, no extra money, and you've got a data dictionary that everybody can see. Like I said, you can also make it as an object in Salesforce. I've done that as well. So classic, easy, great place to start. Super useful. What about release notes, right? So we all know about release notes that Salesforce puts out, right? 3 times a year, 3 releases. We get a new cartoon character. We all go on our Easter egg hunts and like find the new features, right? Hopefully we read the release notes, at least for the clouds that are relevant to us, right? You can do release notes too. It's not just for Salesforce, right? So you can create a list, a report of the changes that you've made, right? If you've gotten your Salesforce org onto a certain release schedule, or even if you're doing more of a continuous development, continuous integration type of pace, you can write release notes for your users in layman's terms to be like, here's the new stuff, right? This is really great for just managing change fatigue, right? Again, the best thing about Salesforce is that you can customize it. The worst thing about Salesforce is you can customize it. Sometimes in organizations, people really struggle a little bit with the stress of change, right? And sometimes the secret to user adoption is just let them know what's going on. And good old release notes are great for this, right? And this eliminates that moment of frustration when a user logs in and goes, my page looks different. Putting out those release notes ahead of time goes a long way towards really kind of helping with a lot of the anxiety.
That assumes people read the release notes.
Assuming
right?
people will read them, yes, but at least you can point them back. So if they complain later, you can say it was in the release notes. Speaking about risk management, that works for people risk too. Yeah. This is just a screen grab from the standard Salesforce release notes. Just kind of gives you a sense of what you can put in there. You can add as much or as little detail as you like. My release notes tend to be fairly short. I also like to augment them with recorded videos. which I think people respond to a whole lot better than long written out
We have a
text.
really awesome question in the chat that I
We
think I
do.
want to
Ooh,
just interrupt you for. Yeah.
yeah, do it.
Hillary says, we have no documentation for our org. Where should we even start? Should this be a collaborative team project?
Ooh.
What if there are frequent changes
Mm.
or frequent business process changes? How do you deal with that too?
Yeah, we are totally going to talk about that. So don't let me forget, Eric. When we get to the how to get started section, please bring that back up again because I super want to answer that specific question.
You
Yeah,
got it.
awesome. Okay,
Fantastic.
thank you so much for that question, Hillary. I appreciate it. Okay, so moving on. I want to spend some time on my favorite, the star, the king, the queen, if you will, of documentation, right? Which is that combination of Salesforce metadata configuration with the why, right? The function or requirement combined with the elements that supported it, right? This can be a description of the requirement. It can be as simple as just the user story or a high-level description of the requirement and a list of the associated components that solve for it, right? Here, when you're getting started, simple is usually best, right? You just basically want to explain, here was the thing, here's why I made the choice that I made, right? It gives posterity, any poor soul who comes after you, right? Consultants, I'm looking at you, right? This should absolutely be in your minimum documentation for your clients. So anybody who comes along later understands why you made the choices that you made. Anyone who's configured anything in Salesforce knows that you are making a million little choices every time you click that mouse, right? Capturing the logic and the strategy behind those choices is super useful. This also makes it a lot easier to manage tech debt. And this goes all the way back to that original, you're looking at a field and you're like, what happens if I delete this field? If you have this type of documentation, you can go back and look, where is this field being used? Why was it originally put there? Do I still need it, right? It's just really the critical missing piece. What you're looking at is a screen grab of what this looks like for our organization. So this is actually documentation for our own org, right? So, but we do the same thing with our clients, right? We define requirements or functions, right? In this case, I'm tracking certifications for people inside of my own organization. I have a user story, and then I have what I call the solution summary or a high level description of like, here's how I solved it in plain English. We say we write these to the Admin 101 standard because we got to start somewhere, right? And then a list of the components. So it makes it really clear to me, why is the credential object there? I can go back and read it, right? Why did I solve a particular thing the way I did? I can read that story, right? Sometimes you run into considerations, things you need to think about in deployment. You've got someplace to put that type of information.
Let me
So
jump in
this
here
is,
real quick. Sorry, Haley, with
yeah,
one more question that just
love it.
popped in that seemed pretty relevant to what you're talking about right now. Volson says, is this different from a traceability matrix?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't think it's quite as technical or as detailed. And a traceability matrix is going back the other way, right? It's going from like individual components back over to the reason, right? In order to get at that, you basically are going to have to create an index for the components, right? And be able to say this is component 137, right? So that you can look them up and tag them essentially in the different requirements. I have done that before. I really like it. It's labor intensive, but it makes managing an org a whole lot easier. This is more geared towards, in particular, say a junior admin, right, who is maintaining a particular area of functionality. They can read this and quickly understand, how was the solution, how was it built, why were the choices made the way they were made, how is that requirement being resolved, right? I think it's also really useful in terms of like when release notes come out and some new feature comes along, it's easy to go through your admin or your these documentation pieces and look at like, well, where was I using maybe that old technology and I maybe need to upgrade it. So this is like the reverse of a traceability matrix, but you can create the two together depending on how you structure it, what tooling you're using. And I have done that and it works great. So that is a really great question. And for those who might not know, a traceability matrix is a way to essentially create a list of all of your configuration items and trace them back to the reason, right? So here I just have like a very plain list of components, but if I were to give these like ID numbers, right, and then I could search all of these documents, where is credential used? How many jobs is it doing, right? And so if I start pulling on that string, how many different functions or requirements might I be upsetting? So super useful. Great question. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. So let's push on a little bit. One of my other favorites, which just does not get enough love, is a business capability map. There are some of these on architect.salesforce.com as well. And you'll see a few of them around the ecosystem from time to time. I have started doing these for like basically every single one of my clients because they're so useful. It's a visual representation of your organization. And I don't mean like your Salesforce org, I mean the organization's competencies, things that the business or the nonprofit does, right? And then those individual functions or requirements in Salesforce that support that particular business capability. So if we take the example of managed user support cases, like in general, our business responds to our users calling us and saying, I have a problem with your product and I need support, right? We may have several functions that are a part of that business capability, like managing queues and using omni-channel and, live agent. Like, it could be a million things that we're doing in Salesforce, right? But it's the idea of taking those requirements and those things we're doing in Salesforce and mapping them against an organizational competency, right? Together, you wind up with essentially a snapshot of what your org is doing to support your business. So solo admins, this is essential for making the argument for why you're awesome and your business needs you and should give you a raise, right? It's a great way to show your boss, look, everything that's happening here is being supported by all of the different work that I do, right? It's a good visual representation. It's also great for strategy. So business leaders, right? I talk to people all the time. I get on the phone with people all the time who say to me, I don't know what's going on with my Salesforce org. I don't know if it's good or it's bad. I don't understand what it is and isn't doing. I don't know if I bought the right product, right? A business capability map is the answer to that set of questions, right? Because it shows all of that really quickly.
Could this, Hayley, also perhaps support the thought behind working in larger organizations where you're one of a few, perhaps admins, or maybe one of 2 or 3, and maybe you need more, showing off everything that you as a team is doing throughout this process and these maps. And
I'm glad you brought that up, because I also think it's really good in those cases where maybe you're doing an awful lot of things that are stretching you beyond a reasonable range of what one professional really ought to be doing topically. So a great example of that is I often see very large organizations that want their Salesforce admin to also be their marketing admin and to also be analytics, right? That's a lot. And those are fundamentally very different business disciplines. And we would normally ask our regular employees to do that, right? But mapping all the things a person is doing against those business domains and functions makes that really clear. So I think that is a really good point. Thank you for that, Eric.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. This is a business capability map from architect.salesforce.com. This is going to be the one place where I'm going to be a little mean to them. This ain't it. All right. If you've seen one of these and thought it was a business capability map, in my opinion, it is not. It is a Salesforce capability map that shows different products in Salesforce mapped to different types of general business processes. What is a good example of a business capability map? Okay, I'm about to show you a really busy slide, but I promise you it's going to be worth it. And if you take one thing down from this call, that very long URL is absolutely something that you should capture. There's a gal who built this and shared this with the ecosystem. All of her information is available at this site, this Prezi site. This is a great business capability map, right? It's color-coded as well. But basically, this is a hypothetical enterprise. So this would be a business. So this is a for-profit scenario, right? And there's a marketing department and there's a sales department and we do CPQ and we do orders and commerce. But underneath each of these areas, right, we have a set of cards. I'm going to zoom in on one of these shortly and show you. But those are the major business capabilities. And underneath it, she has the functions in Salesforce that support those business capabilities listed, right? So I am going to, I can't actually, I will give the URL in, I'm sorry, let me go back to my slideshow. I will give the URL shortly in the chat channel when we get around to just questions. So here's a zoom in
right now for you, Hayley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So if we zoom in here on sales, right, we see particular areas like account management, right, compensation management, so like tracking which salespeople get what benefits, right? And then underneath this are like functions that are happening in Salesforce, right? It's a really great way to map those out. And this is a super detailed version, and she's got like KPIs and best practices in here. So you can see how far you can take this. But let's look at a little bit simpler version, right? Oops. Oh no, I didn't do it. Okay, I'm so sorry. You can also just literally have this as like marketing, lead gen, right? We're using Pardot. We're doing these campaigns, right? We're basically mapping those things. I've seen this also done in some organizations where I'm going to back up one where the color coding is about the health, right? So I actually do this for my own org, but the way I do it is I give them letter grades, which are a function of like how many complaints I get about something and how well I think it's running, right? So that you can look at all of it and see the colors and be like, ooh, we're really sucking at marketing. That's not going so well. But hey, we're crushing it at service, right? And kind of highlighting those areas and being thoughtful about where you want to put resources and time, right? Really great artifact, really does a good job of showing all of the things that a Salesforce instance and its related products might be supporting inside of an organization and giving you the ability to zoom in on some pretty good detail. Okay, so here's where I really want to talk about the things that Hillary's talking about, right? Like, oh, how do I get started, right? Like, why now? I don't have the time. I don't have the skills. Like, what might be holding you back, right? The biggest thing that I would say at the outset. So I'm gonna actually pull up the chat so I can really zero in on Hillary's question because it's such a good. Oh, I guess I can't while I'm presenting. Anyway, because it's such a really good crystallization of that idea, which is you have like a very complex org, like where do you get started, right? This really feels overwhelming, right? Where do you really begin? How do you get that type of focus? My argument, I would tell you a couple of things. First, any documentation is better than no documentation. Whatever you do moves the needle and makes your job easier. So you can't screw this up. Any level of effort you do is going to improve the situation. That having been said, the best place to start, the place I start with most of my clients at the very beginning, is a data dictionary. It's simple to start, right? It's as simple as going into the Salesforce org and copying and pasting. You can literally do it from inside of setup. You can do it from the developer console if you know how to query like the different elements, right? Copy and paste all of the fields, get them all into a spreadsheet, organize them by the object, and start keeping track of what is in your org. That's a great place to get started, right? Then you can start to reconstruct the whys, right? And start by capturing your business requirements, right? What have you guys done to the org? Why was the configuration done? Making a list of all of those functions and then starting to draw those lines. Doesn't have to be fancy. Regular old Google works really great for this, right? And you can start creating documents that capture all of this stuff, right? I would say there's never a good time. So I really have the line in here, why now? I don't have the time. Nobody has the time. It's never a good time, right? So my argument would be anytime you're going to do any type of work in Salesforce, carving out some measure of time that is a part of any of those projects to document as you go is critical. There are schools of thought here. I know people that don't document until they've completely made a thing. And their argument is, well, I may make a lot of changes as I go, right? And I don't want to waste a bunch of time writing things down. I do not subscribe to that school of thought, although I'm not saying I think it's invalid. I'm pretty quick with a copy paste. So as I'm building things in Salesforce, I'm adding them directly into my data dictionary because it's too hard for me to remember all the things I did and be sure I got all of it. Maybe if you have a younger, fresher brain than I do, you can do that, right? But the answer of when is the right time, there's never a good time. Start now. And I would argue when in doubt, document as you go. Lots of people feel like they don't have the skills. Hogwash. If you have the skills to create custom fields in Salesforce, you have the skills to begin to document your custom fields. Again, it doesn't have to be fancy. Just start with a simple data dictionary, right? Coming back to the how do I get started? Any start is a good start. They're all better than nothing. But again, I would take you back to start with a data dictionary, and then step 2, start capturing the requirements or the functions that your Salesforce org does. Over time, you can build up that relationship, right? Those lists of components are supporting a regular function as you continue to work on it and improve it.
Part of
And those are great
Hillary's
ways to get started.
question was, should this be a collaborative team project? I
Mhm.
suspect I know your answer to that is going to be yes, absolutely. Right?
Absolutely.
I wasn't
Yes.
enthusiastic enough. Well put.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely right. And of course, frequent business changes requires frequent updates to your documentation. Otherwise, your documentation is poor, right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct, right? So there's 2 dimensions to that, right? There's like the technical documentation piece as a collaborative effort. If there are multiple people working, then it is by definition collaborative. It is not acceptable for anybody to be working, in my opinion, in any environment, just YOLO and developing without writing down anything that they're doing, right? But where I think the collaboration piece is perhaps even more key and more frequently neglected is in the documentation of those things outside of Salesforce, the extra Salesforce things like business processes, user stories, the nature of the requirement. That's a collaboration between you and your users, right? That's talking with them, capturing all of it, going back. Did I get it right? Checking up on it, refreshing it regularly. Is this still the way you guys do business? And I think if you can get to a place structurally in an organization where specific people or business units own some of those requirements and understand that they have skin in the game too, and it's part of their obligation to be actively involved in making sure that you have the best requirements, that's a great place to be. But that's culture, and it takes time to build, for sure.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any fresh questions in the chat, and we did actually get the LinkedIn Live rolling about a third to half of the way through.
Fantastic.
No questions came up over there that I noticed up to this point. I just threw in the chat a link to a form for everybody that's been online with us today to give us some feedback about today's session, how you enjoyed it. There are certain things maybe you didn't like, maybe it was too snarky. I know Hayley well enough to realize it probably wasn't your normal, totally snarky presentation, but it was still pretty up there. It was still pretty up there, but really, really good stuff shared, Hayley. It was pretty amazing. So feel free to let us know how you felt. You can see on the slide Hayley's got up, you can see how you can reach her at Hayley Tuller. That's on Twitter or X if you want to be technical.
I refuse.
I'm not sure. I keep saying it's always going to be Twitter to me. I'm going to get snarky for a quick second here. Hayley, you have a typo on that slide where it says, "What's the deal with documentation?" Documentation is spelled
wrong. Oh my goodness, I
do. So, hey, another sign that it's a live demo or something, right? You got a typo.
It's real. It's
real. So anyway, again, everybody, thanks for joining us today. Next week, we're back to what I'm going to half jokingly call our normal time, which is an hour earlier than today started, which is, I think, when the majority of these have taken place. And next week, we have Prag Ravichandran, if I'm butchering his name correctly, from Canada, who's going to be joining us, and we'll be talking all about Salesforce security and all the various intricacies around security and why it's important.
That's a big topic.
How you implement it and blah, 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 and all that other stuff.
Better him than me.
Way up here, and my knowledge is way down there. So I'm glad that he's an expert, and he's going to share all of his knowledge on that one. Allison, I see you just typed in the chat. Are we going to share the slides? I'm sure we can do that as well. Probably we can throw a link out into the LinkedIn thread where this is going on. People can grab it there, or they can just simply message me direct or Hayley as well. And either one of us would be happy to share slides. So with that, since I don't see any further questions, getting some kudos and some thanks out there in chat land now, Hayley. So of course, thank you from me and from our partner SaaS Guru as well. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks everybody.
Bye y'all. Bye.